All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We had a really great first session. Now we're going to transition to our next session on the United States and South Korea's strategies in the Indo-Pacific and how we can cooperate economically in the region. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator, Mark Milley from the U.S.-ASEAN Business Council. Mark?
Great. Thank you, Troy. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen, on this brisk Washington, D.C. Post-morning day. First of all, it's a great honor and pleasure to be here this morning. Over the last couple of years, my colleagues and I at the U.S.-ASEAN Business Council have been involved in a number of conversations that have looked at around U.S.-Japan cooperation in third country markets and other parts of Asia. So for me to have an opportunity to be part of this conversation that will look at sort of American and Korean opportunities for cooperation in other parts of Asia, I think is very timely. I think this morning's, the first panel, I think probably gave us some good context for how, amongst terms of the bilateral economic relationship between our two countries moving forward, what are some of the opportunities that do lie ahead. I'm sure all of you know that ASEAN is Asia's premier regional trade and investment hub. It comprises 10 Southeast Asian nations with a combined GDP now approaching almost $3 trillion US. Average GDP growth in the region is about 5% per year. ASEAN has really the most extensive network of preferential trading relationships with all of Asia's major economies via its bilateral, regional, plurilateral FTAs. And we're talking about a group of countries with over 600 million in population, mostly under the age of 30, so still a relatively young population, which is one of the reasons why we at the U.S.-ASEAN Business Council note that ASEAN countries really represent some of the most highly competed for markets in the world. You find American, Korean, Japanese, Chinese, European companies, Indian companies, not to mention the many world-class companies that are really ASEAN homegrown companies that are all basically competing in these markets. Our panel this morning will focus on some of the potential opportunities and challenges for U.S. and South Korea to use their respective strategies, the free and open Indo-Pacific, as well as South Korea's new Southern policy, in ways which can help the business communities from both countries to compete more effectively in ASEAN, particularly in some of the areas like energy, infrastructure, and also in development assistance. It's been my experience that when foreign companies, supported by their governments, are able to align their business development interests in ways which also help to address some of the real constraints that Southeast Asian nations face in terms of their own growth agenda, those companies tend to do very well in Southeast Asia. And I think there's no question that there's clearly world-class resources and expertise that I think a Team USA and a Team Korea could certainly bring to the ASEAN marketplace. Obviously, we're having a chance to have this conversation just after the recent East Asia summits, where it was very clear that both Vice President Pence and President Moon reiterated their respective nations' real interests in deepening ties with the countries in Southeast Asia. So that as a bit of a scene setter, very excited that we have two presenters, one Mr. David Feith of the Policy and Planning Staff at the U.S. State Department, where he serves as the Senior Advisor to the Secretary of State on Asian Affairs, including U.S. relations with countries across the Indo-Pacific region. We also have Mr. Jae Kwong Park. He's a Senior Coordinator at the Secretariat on the Presidential Committee on the New Southern Policy. We also have four very knowledgeable discussants. I introduced them very quickly. Mr. Young-Woo Ro, who's the editor of World News Desk at the Mail Business News. Jaeon Lee, who's a senior fellow for the Center for ASEAN and Oceania Studies at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Michael Kugelman, who's a deputy director and senior associate for Southeast Asia at the Wilson Center, and Eric Altbach, who's a senior vice president at one of my own member companies at the USABC at Albridge Stonebridge. So this morning we've asked our two presenters to make remarks for about 10 to 15 minutes. We'll give them a chance to put some things on the table, and then we're going to invite our four discussants to have about 7 to 10 minutes or so to offer some comments and reactions to the remarks. We do want to try to leave some time to get some questions from you in the audience, so I'll kind of probably be a little mini dictator to make sure that we do stay on time and we don't stand in the way of folks getting to either lunch or their next appointment. So let me first invite Mr. David Feith to make his comments as a first presenter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to the Korea Economic Institute for having us, to my State Department colleagues, to our Korean co-sponsors, and to everyone who organized this very important forum. It's a privilege to speak about the U.S. approach to the Indo-Pacific. As we've been articulating for a bit more than a year, the U.S. is pursuing an Indo-Pacific vision that the President announced in Da Nang last year at the APEC summit that focuses on respect for the diversity of Indo-Pacific nations, achieving an order in the region in which all countries can live prosperously side by side as sovereigns, free from foreign coercion and interference. For this, the region needs to be free and open. Encouraging high standard, sustainable, transparent private investment is a hugely important part of this. And so the importance of forums like this is very clear. The U.S. Indo-Pacific vision emphasizes deepened engagement across three pillars: economics, governance, and security. Through various efforts, we will seek to protect the sovereignty of nations and preserve access to the commons, encourage the deployment of private capital in the region, strengthen civil society with an emphasis on creating transparent environments conducive to private investment, boost security partnerships for capacity and burden sharing, strengthen the digital world's governance and sovereignty, deepen new partnerships with countries across the region, in Southeast Asia, obviously, partners to include Vietnam, Indonesia, and others, with India and other South Asian nations, improve trade and investment standards, increase energy exports, infrastructure, efficiency, and security, and invest in human capital for the future. In the trade and economic space in particular, we're focused on expanding high-quality private investment, especially in infrastructure, energy, and digital economy. At the Indo-Pacific Business Forum this summer in Washington, Secretary Pompeo launched 3 initiatives, one in each of these areas: the Infrastructure Transaction and Assistance Network, the Asia Edge initiative focused on enhancing development and growth through energy, and the Digital Cooperation and Cybersecurity Partnership. All these initiatives have 2 main purposes. The first, to spur high-quality, sustainable investment through capacity building, development finance, and other means. And second, to serve as platforms for cooperation with partner countries. A very important milestone in recent months in these efforts was the passage about 2 months ago of the BUILD Act, an effort that has more than doubled the U.S. government's development finance capacity to $60 billion. The new Development Finance Corporation that results from this new law, which is expected to go online next autumn, is building on the very substantial, although sometimes overlooked, foundation of U.S. private investment across the Indo-Pacific region. The U.S. has nearly $1 trillion in current U.S. FDI across the region, a number that has more than doubled since 2007. The principles that are guiding our approach include openness, transparency, inclusiveness, respect for international standards, and strong support for ASEAN and other regional institutions. We know that in these principles and in the rest of our Indo-Pacific vision, we share very much in common with South Korea's new Southern policy. So I'm glad to outline some of these commonalities and areas of cooperation. As we see it, cooperation is a necessity, not a luxury. We need to be entrepreneurial in establishing platforms and projects for cooperation on this range of issues. We and our allies and partners have done certain things well in the region, in the economic space for some time, to include technical assistance, capacity building, and other efforts. But obviously, part of what is motivating our approach today is a recognition that some of this work has not been sufficient. We need to do additional and new things as a U.S. government and with our partners. We've started to do this in various ways. In addition to the 3 initiatives launched by Secretary Pompeo and other cabinet chiefs this summer in infrastructure, energy, and digital economy, and in addition to the BUILD Act, we've seen in recent months a range of other important efforts. So the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, which through the BUILD Act is being expanded in its authorities and in its lending capacity, has signed recently MOUs with Japan, with Australia, trilaterally with Japan and Australia, and is pursuing additional new partnerships of these kinds across the region. They're also in the process of some of what is resulting from the BUILD Act, shifting some of their personnel footprint to include additional personnel in the region to look for deals with partners. OPIC and the Japan Bank for International Cooperation are right now under the MOU they signed a year ago, looking at a range of projects in the region in the sort of sectors that we've been highlighting. There is also the Japan-U.S. Strategic Energy Partnership, launched a year ago, with a recent announcement that Japan and the U.S. would cooperate on the coordination of $10 billion in Japanese public and private investment planned to come online in regional energy infrastructure across the Indo-Pacific. When Vice President Pence was recently in the region, we announced the establishment of a U.S.-Asean Smart Cities Initiative. This is consistent with the emphasis on digital economy and the announcement this summer of the Digital Cooperation and Cybersecurity Partnership. The Vice President also participated in Papua New Guinea in the announcement of a 5-party project to advance the electrification of PNG to 70% by 2030 from about 13% today. The parties there include the U.S., Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea. The Vice President also announced the launch of an Indo-Pacific Transparency Initiative to highlight the really central importance of work in the governance space and the importance of strong civil society, strong anti-corruption practices, and transparency in organizing the sorts of investment climates needed to attract sustainable and high-standard private investment and to really defend societies against corruption, coercion, and other troubles. From conversations with our South Korean counterparts, it's obvious that there is very substantial alignment between the U.S. vision and the Korean vision. Both approaches look to deepen engagement in Southeast Asia and in South Asia, including in India. Both focus on openness, transparency, inclusivity, international standards, and regional institutions. We share the focus and admire the cleverness and alliterative quality of the Korean focus on, let's get the poetry correct, on people, prosperity, and peace. And as the Korean Foreign Ministry said after some consultations between our sides in August, the two sides took note of the complementary nature of the new Southern policy and the Indo-Pacific strategy and agreed to continue efforts to find common elements and expand cooperation between the ROK and the United States in a wider range of areas. Particular areas of obvious promise include transportation, energy, natural resources and water management, cybersecurity and digital economy, civilian maritime law enforcement, counterterrorism, and other areas. It would seem with particular opportunities in the spaces of energy, cybersecurity, and water management, just to start. We have shared focus in important partners of ours, such as Vietnam and Indonesia, countries where both of us obviously have many incumbent programs and business relationships, and there's a lot to build on separately and together. Our alliance, the US-ROK alliance, is obviously multifaceted with a range of trade and investment and security and people-to-people aspects. It includes, obviously, the imperative of addressing North Korea. Finding the optimal balance of cooperative priorities is always an iterative and often challenging process. But it is certainly clear in our thinking that cooperation between the New Southern Policy and our Indo-Pacific vision would benefit both sides and the region. So it's a privilege to be able to discuss that further. I look forward to the comments of our other panelists and, of course, to questions from the floor. Thank you.
Very good morning. Thank you very much, my home ministry, MOFA, ROK, and KEI, for having me here today. Let me start by introducing the organizational structure for New Southern Policy. The Presidential Committee on New Southern Policy was established. Sorry, probably some technical issue. Right. The committee was established in August this year, based on direct instruction from the President Moon Jae-in, and the committee is chaired by Senior Economic Advisor to the President at Blue House as a concurrent position. And the members are vice ministers of government ministries, and they meet every 3 months. And there's a standing secretariat with seconded government officials, including myself. And the secretariat supports the function of the committee. And New Southern Policy is an essential initiative of foreign policy and external economy of President Moon Jae-in administration, together with New Northern Policy, the cooperation with countries in the North and Eurasia, and New Economic Map Initiative, which is aimed at building economic community on the Korean Peninsula with 3 economic belts. Then why New Southern Policy? Even before the inauguration in May 2017, President Moon and his campaign team floated the idea of looking Southeast Asia and India with renewed vigor. It was suggested in an effort for diversifying Korea's partners of diplomacy and external economies. Faced with a conundrum with China over the deployment of missile defense system, many in Korea have echoed support for the policy. We may call this as a push factor for looking towards countries in the South. Together with the push factor, there are, of course, pull factors. ASEAN, the 10-country bloc, with a population of 640 million, has been recording over 5% annual GDP growth from the current 6th economy with GDP of $2.7 trillion US. In 2030, ASEAN is expected to become the 4th economy after US, China, and EU. Likewise, India, with over 1.3 billion population and with over 7% GDP growth, will surely continue to rise. Now let me give you some idea on the current status where the ASEAN-Korea relations are with some figures. ASEAN marks Korea's #2 trading partner with around $150 billion US as of 2017. With this, ASEAN accounts for 14% among total trade volume of Korea. When it comes to an export alone, ASEAN accounts for 18% of total export of Korea, which is a sharp increase from 10% 10 years ago. And among the ASEAN member states, the case for Vietnam is more remarkable. Vietnam now becomes Korea's #3 export destination after China and US. And in 2020, in 2 years' time, Korea's export volume to Vietnam may exceed the export to EU of 28 countries. With current trajectory, we expect to reach one of the New Southern Policy target number, $200 billion US of trade with ASEAN by 2020. Equally impressive is in the field of people-to-people exchange. One of the 3 Korean tourists are heading towards Southeast Asia. It is expected the number of two-way visitors reach first time ever over 10 million by the end of this year. Again, we expect the number of visitors reach another target number of 15 million by 2020. So far, New Southern Policy is nicely embraced by countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Of course, It is because there are no hidden agenda, no historic animosity or remorse, no territorial issues. There are enough level of comfort among us, and the popularity of Korean pop culture is a big contributor to it. All in all, there are positive grounds to promote New Southern policy. Now let me touch upon the contents of New Southern policy with more details. In November 2017, during his first tour of ASEAN countries, President Moon elaborated New Southern policy with the concept of ASEAN-Korea Community of Shared Future and the 3 Ps, or peace, prosperity, and people. The 3P community is equivalent to the ASEAN community of 3 pillars. With this, President wanted to emphasize Korea's future is inextricably linked with ASEAN and their need to foster a greater sense of community between ASEAN and Korea. During his tour of India in July this year, similar concept was elaborated. Vision of New Southern policy is set as establishing a people-centered community of peace and prosperity. And altogether, 16 priority areas have been set, and 5 or 6 for each pillar. With the conceptualized framework as a guideline, government ministries are now developing plan of action or concrete projects and programs. Let me elaborate a couple of areas for each pillar. First, people pillar. In order to increase the number of mutual visitors, measures are being taken to facilitate the travel of ASEAN citizens to Korea. Since last week, the category of multiple entry visa issuance has widely been expanded to people of Southeast Asia and South Asia. Similar measures will be considered to further ease the entry and exit, if not visa exemption, for the moment. Second, human resources capacity building. A new governmental scholarship scheme will be arranged to attract more talented students from the region. And third, for quality of life of people in the region, more grants from government agency KOICA will be funneled into the sector of education, health, and agriculture, among others. For the prosperity pillar or economic side, it is important for the government to support private companies, particularly the SMEs or MSMEs, the backbones of both Korea and the ASEAN economy, to do more business with each other. Now a new financial scheme is in the making, pending approval by the Parliament, to help MSMEs have a better access to financing. With expanded asset for the Credit Guarantee Fund, more SMEs may have breathing space for business in the region. Another is infrastructure, or physical connectivity by ASEAN wording. There's a strong belief in the region that infrastructure development leads to overall economic growth. It will contribute to narrowing development gap among the ASEAN member states as well as within a country. Also, infrastructure will also improve quality of life of people, thereby achieving people-centered ASEAN, as enshrined in ASEAN Vision 2025 and in Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity 2025. Thus, important for quality infrastructure development in mutually beneficial way is first, finding bankable projects, and second, with affordable financing, a third, in sustainable manner. In an effort to support the connectivity, the physical connectivity, a new funding source is in the making in Korea, in addition to existing ones. The Korea Exim Bank has provided concessionary loan to foreign governments. So last year it amounted to $350 million US, and also the bank loans to private companies investing in ASEAN. Every year it amounts to $5 billion US. Now a new fund named ASEAN Korea Infrastructure Cooperation Fund with the amount of $100 million is to be made. And the fund will be used for equity investment for PPP projects. To manage the fund and facilitate more investments, a new agency called Korea Overseas Infrastructure and Urban Development Corporation was established in June this year. And my colleague from the State Department mentioned we are watching closely with interest a similar agency is in the making in Washington, D.C., the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Here we may seek collaboration between the two agencies. Financial engagement from the U.S. side, either in the form of equity investment or loans, may make synergy when it is coupled with the experience and know-how of public corporations of Korea. And then move on to peace pillar. First, summit diplomacy. Next year, 10 ASEAN leaders will visit Korea for ASEAN-Korea Special Summit commemorating the 30th anniversary of Dialogue Partnership. At the same time, inaugural Mekong-Korea leaders meeting will also be held. This sub-regional cooperation along the Mekong provides another area of collaboration between Korea and the U.S. With experience by each side, the LMI Lower Mekong Initiative by the U.S. and Mekong-Korea Ministerial by Korea, we may seek synergy in implementing projects at the sub-regional level. For economic cooperation, the main actor is the private sector, and the government role is a catalyst. For peace, governments should play a more active role to provide secure environment for the private sector to do their business with confidence. So the New Southern Policy identifies common security issue of the region, such as Korean Peninsula, maritime security, including sea piracy and marine environment, and non-traditional trans-border security issues, including cybersecurity. Finally, let me briefly touch upon multilateral dimension of the New Southern Policy. I would emphasize that New Southern Policy has a vision of not just ASEAN or India and Korea, but the region as a whole. As the vision indicates, New Southern Policy pursues people-centered community of peace and prosperity in the region with openness and inclusivity. In the course of reaching this vision, we are also putting high value on ASEAN-led regional cooperation mechanism, or ASEAN centrality. We expect the trust deficit in Northeast Asia may also be complemented with the ASEAN-led mechanism, or ASEAN +3. Under New Southern Policy, Korea is also actively participating in other regional architectures such as East Asia Summit, EAS, and ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF, and ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting, ADMM+, with the belief that such mechanisms are mutually reinforcing and complementary each other. Once again, the New Northern Policy is not limited to a certain number of countries. It is to be evolving concept with openness and inclusivity. And in this context, I would like to share with you that Korea joined recently the Indian Ocean Rim Association, the IORA, as a dialogue partner. Having said that, I would conclude with high hope the newly suggested initiatives, including Indo-Pacific strategy, may contribute to the peace and prosperity in the region with reinforcing existing regional architecture. And also hope that this forum will provide useful momentum for Korea and U.S. public and private sector to discuss the way how to make the synergy and collaboration between the New Southern Policy and Indo-Pacific strategy. Thank you very much.
First, Mr. Fife and Mr. Park, thank you very much for those sort of two scene-setting remarks. I've oftentimes, in listening to folks from our government, sort of try to describe, what are the real tangible building blocks or focus of, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And I've often walked away, and Dave, you correct me if I'm wrong, I almost get the sense what you're really trying to do is, how can the United States really invest in some of the kinds of structures and institutions that are really fundamental to create a real market system where the private sector can then really be that key driver for countries to look at how they want to pursue their growth and their development, so to speak. And to me, it's a very interesting, someone who's been in this town for a long time, I've oftentimes wondered if we didn't sometimes like get the cart before the horse. We sometimes say, let's liberalize markets, whereas the real basic structure of the market really hadn't been put in place. Whereas you want to build those structures, and then markets can become more liberalized and more open and really operate more efficiently. I was also struck by, Mr. Park, your observation about Vietnam and the rapid growth of trade flows between Korea and Vietnam. I can tell you also that while, Malaysia and Singapore are right now, bigger markets for U.S. exports and U.S. companies, there's no question that Vietnam is probably the fastest growing market for the United States. And I think you really see that. I always tell my friends in this town, the one country that I see more inbound delegations coming from all of Southeast Asia, it's the Vietnamese. I mean, it's almost like every month, provincial delegations, business delegations. In fact, I've got a delegation of folks coming from the agricultural sector just next week, in fact, coming to Washington. And you really kind of see that really dynamic pace of strengthening our ties. So let me now give a chance for our four discussants to offer some of their thoughts and reactions to our presentation, and maybe even get some additional points on the table. So the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Eric Altbach from the Albright-Stonebridge Group, and my perspective will come from my background of 15 years working in the U.S. government at the State Department, National Security Council, and Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, but also in my current capacity at Albright-Stonebridge Group, a global strategy firm serving clients throughout the region. My responsibilities are for China, Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. So the subject of our discussions today is very much on my mind. And I've been talking with our colleagues both in Washington and based in Southeast Asia to get their perspective on the ground as well. And I've been struck in the discussions so far today about the strong areas of commonality between the U.S. Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy and the new Southern strategy of the Korean government. And because of those commonalities and the imperatives, both strategic, diplomatic, and economic, that have motivated our two countries to develop and carry out these strategies, I think it's really incumbent on the two governments to work together more effectively, both to communicate the priorities and to integrate and coordinate the activities that are really flowering, as we've heard about already. I was asked to speak to the sort of private sector pillar. What can the two countries do to promote commercial activity? It's sometimes in policy discussions like this, it's framed as a question of how can the governments direct investment, trade, and other commercial activities by our private sectors in service of these, strategic policy objectives. That's, of course, not how it works. Governments can create policy initiatives, carry out efforts to reduce barriers to trade and investment that allow private sector activities to flower. They can create capacity building that assist the potential recipient countries in understanding the needs of the foreign business community and doing the hard work of harmonizing policies and regulations that impose barriers on companies that wish to expand their activities in the Indo-Pacific region in this case. So I think that's the way we should frame the evaluation and the outlook for these separate policy initiatives, but also the challenge for the enhanced coordination that I think is so important. And if you think about the nature of the U.S. Korea alliance, as was discussed earlier, And I like the way that Joy talked about it, that it is no longer and should not any longer be a bilateral initiative, in the sense that its objectives should be to enhance our coordination across an array of issues on a regional and global basis. That has also been the case with the U.S.-Japan alliance. And in our discussions, we've talked about some of the areas of cooperation, the expanded areas of cooperation that are such a feature of the U.S.-Japan alliance and our bilateral dialogues, and are an important part of the Indo-Pacific initiative. And I know that the governments are talking about how to enhance that component of the U.S. Korea relationship, but I think it's really important. And the U.S. Korea relationship has lagged in that area. You know, there are good reasons for that. I think Korea is a bit later in terms of its aspirations for regional and global leadership. But the fact that Korea is promoting these kinds of initiatives, I think, is very important. But how can they be more effective in achieving this goal of driving trade and investment flows? The focus on infrastructure, I think, is an important one, creating the physical infrastructure necessary for the countries in the Indo-Pacific and particularly in Southeast Asia to be able to handle and facilitate a greater presence of foreign companies and a greater exposure to international markets. So infrastructure is very important. But what's the context for investment in infrastructure? Gigantic need, a lagging of private sector investment in this area, and a huge initiative from China, the Belt and Road initiative. So we're competing in this context. And neither the United States, frankly, or Korea has put the kind of money on the table that will drive this kind of infrastructure investment, which has implications for the ability of our companies to participate in many of these projects. But working together, and I think this also implies cooperation with other like-minded partners, including Japan, we can put together infrastructure investment programs and projects that demonstrate the better way of carrying out these kinds of projects, that are more transparent, that have stronger guarantees against corruption, that seek to support the technical capacity of recipient countries, that are more concerned about the environmental and social impact of projects. These are things that are desired in the region, and some of the early problems with the Belt and Road projects throughout Southeast Asia and elsewhere, I think, demonstrate that recipient countries have a desire for a stronger role. And we can sort of multiply the impact of U.S. initiatives and Korean initiatives by coordinating them more effectively, by identifying joint projects. I think that's very, very important and holds a lot of promise. And really, there is no choice but to do more of that in order to be an effective counterweight against what the Chinese are doing. And I think we'll be welcomed in the region, and it will create much greater opportunities for U.S. and Korean companies in infrastructure. But if you think about other areas, and the ICT sector, I think, is one that's gotten a lot of attention, and rightly so, we are in a period of tremendous uncertainty about the global trading system, and this has a huge impact on the ICT sector. And of course, the looming change in the terms and conditions of trade in the ICT sector is the U.S.-China trade conflict. The outlook is uncertain. We're in the process of a very high-level effort to resolve some of these core issues. But the barriers to success are real. So there is the possibility that the ICT supply chain, which extends extensively into China, could be subject to a dramatically different environment in terms of tariffs. That has implications for U.S. companies and Korean companies. It is also combined with other factors, including regulatory and policy concerns in China, IP enforcement issues, forced tech transfer, and then just cost structure issues. It combines with these other factors to encourage companies from the United States, from Korea, to expand their investments in ASEAN countries to reduce their risk, to reduce their costs, and to create more efficiencies in terms of their management of the global supply chain across the ICT sectors. The problem is that while this is something ASEAN welcomes, there's tremendous opportunities, there are real policy problems that have to be overcome. And this is an area in which the U.S. and Korean governments have some impediments to being effective. One of the best ways, as speaking as a former USTR official, to help overcome the market access barriers and regulatory challenges, tariffs, investment restrictions, regulatory barriers, such as the kind we've talked about in the digital space, data localization requirements, local content requirements, cybersecurity regulations that require certification or other practices that are a deterrent to enhance localization of activities in the ICT sector. Overcoming these kinds of problems can most effectively be done in the context of trade negotiations. We've made significant progress in this area through the TPP, but unfortunately the United States is no longer a part of that process. Fortunately, Japan has chosen to take it forward and shown great leadership working with other members of the TPP-11, and that agreement will come into implementation. But agreements have to be enforced, and the U.S. will not be a part of enforcing the rules of TPP, which are supposed to drive harmonization and liberalization across the Asia-Pacific. And there is a real need for progress in this area. We've talked about Vietnam being so interested in attracting more foreign investment and all of the foreign company interest in Vietnam. Vietnam implemented a Decree 116 in the auto sector that was incredibly disruptive to auto trade. That remains a huge problem. Vietnam is is in the process of implementing data localization requirements that are very disruptive to businesses across a range of sectors. So there is a need to enforce these rules and to create more effective and expanded rules that go beyond the foundation of the TPP. The U.S. government is hard-pressed to do that because we're not a part of that initiative. So we need to have a trade agenda that addresses these things, whether it's through new bilateral FTA processes with Vietnam, the Philippines, or other ASEAN economies, or through the much more difficult effort of jawboning through bilateral engagement. But we can be more effective if we coordinate these efforts with like-minded countries, such as Korea. Korea is also in this same challenging situation. Korea is not a part of the TPP either. So they don't have the enforcement mechanisms to draw on that will be part of that agreement. Korea has lagged with its own FTA initiatives in ASEAN, partly because of the slow pace of the ASEAN +3 efforts and the slow pace of the regional comprehensive economic partnership, the RCEP negotiations, the peer competitor of the TPP. So the U.S. and Korea have some problems to overcome in terms of our mechanisms for driving regulatory and policy changes in the Southeast Asian region in order to create a more permissive environment for our companies to expand their investments, to increase our trade flows with the region, and to strengthen this commercial underpinning of these strategic policy initiatives that the two governments are pursuing. And in the absence of these binding trade agreement negotiations, it really is in the interests of the U.S. and Korea to spend a lot of time, and it's hard work, identifying common policy concerns with these specific trading partners, coordinating our messaging, consulting with each other in advance of high-level meetings, whether they're summits or economic engagement, and doing the work of pushing our trading partners to do better, to allow our companies to take advantage of these new opportunities and strengthen the commercial partnerships that both the U.S. and Korea have with Southeast Asia. It's not easy. It doesn't happen by itself. You have to put the work in. You have to carve out time in the U.S.-Korea bilateral discussions to say, what are we going to do to advance these top priorities on commercial trade issues in Southeast Asia? What are our upcoming meetings? Let's collaborate on our talking points. How will we build on the success? So I know I've gone on too long of this, and as you can tell, I'm passionate as a former trade negotiator. But we hear from our the companies that we serve in these regions, these are the kinds of issues that they are trying to overcome on their own. They need the assistance and support of our governments to do it. And the U.S. and Korea have a tremendous opportunity, I think, to do more in this area.
Thank you, and very good morning, everyone in this room. My name is Jae-hyun Lee from the ASEAN Institute based in Seoul. Okay, this is a very rare chance for me to speak in Washington, D.C., because mainly I'm looking at Southeast Asia and the multilateral cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region. And there is not much chance for me to make a trip to the States. Of course, I have extensive network and dialogue with my Southeast Asian colleagues, but not much with the U.S. experts looking at Southeast Asia. So this is a very precious chance for me to exchange my views with the U.S. Colleague. And I believe this session is a bit different from other sessions, the first session and the session 3. Because in the first session and in the third session, we are more discussing the bilateral issues, bilateral economic cooperation between Korea and the States. But this session, we are talking about New Southern Policy and the Indo-Pacific initiative by the U.S. government. And of course, we have audience of our policies. So we have to put this audience into the equation. Otherwise, our discussion is meaningless. So basically, I will focus on Southeast Asia in my comments. And I will make 3 points in my discussion. And the first point is directly related to my own experience in this area of study. I want to first make comments on the structure of cooperation between Korea and Southeast Asia, as well as U.S. and Southeast Asian countries. As I mentioned, I don't have much chance to make a trip to the United States and speak in this kind of forum, which means that we don't have much discussion among the experts, the Korean experts on Southeast Asia and regional issues, and the U.S. experts on Southeast Asian affairs. If you look at the current structure of cooperation between regional countries and Southeast Asia is kind of a receiving hub, and the other regional countries are providing spoke. Then we have here a kind of hub and spoke system. The South Korean government is providing something, and the U.S. is providing something to Southeast Asian countries, and Australia, Japan, China, all these regional countries are doing some kind of project, providing assistance to Southeast Asian countries. But unfortunately, among those spokes countries, we don't have much dialogue. What sort of things, what sort of project we are doing with Southeast Asian countries, and what kind of assistance we are providing to Southeast Asian countries. The net consequence of this kind of structure is that there are a lot of waste of resource, a lot of overlappings, a lot of waste of energy. And this means our cooperation, economic cooperation or economic assistance to Southeast Asian countries are ineffective in a way and inefficient. So we need to have a dialogue among those spokes countries, how to better provide assistance and economic cooperation with Southeast Asian countries. This is not just about economic cooperation or business cooperation. We can expand this to the strategic, defense, and security cooperation with Southeast Asian countries. For example, South Korean government so far has done a lot of have made a lot of efforts to develop our non-traditional and human security cooperation with Southeast Asian countries. And I believe the United States has excellent agencies and knowledge regarding the natural disasters and humanitarian assistance. The one I saw in Hawaii, under the Pacific, U.S. Pacific Command, they have extensive knowledge, database, and all kind of a project with the regarding the regional natural disasters. So in this kind of area, we can put our hands together to help our Southeast Asian countries. And for that, we need a lot of discussions among us. Then further, we developed this spoke-to-spoke discussion into a kind of triangular or trilateral discussion, putting the ASEAN into the room as well. So as a receiving end, Southeast Asia is there. As a providing end, Korea and the United States there. We can have a trilateral dialogue in this format. And the second point I would like to make is the kind of a vision or direction of our economic cooperation with Southeast Asian countries. If you look at what's going on in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific region, there is a kind of dominant economic assistance provider at the moment called China. With the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese government is pouring heaps of so much money into the region, and so many Southeast Asian countries are so much interested in getting the Chinese economic assistance. But the problem with the Chinese investment in Southeast Asia is just wondering if Chinese assistance to Southeast Asian countries does it really mind the elevating the quality of life of ordinary people? Are they making good for the welfare of communities in Southeast Asia? And the Chinese investment in Southeast Asia is talking about connectivity. And what kind of connectivity is China talking about? It's mainly about linking China into the Southeast Asian countries for the benefit of China. And our approach to the Southeast Asian countries, our joint effort to Southeast Asian countries should be different. And we have to more mind about the quality of life, the benefit of communities, and Southeast Asia. I mean, we have lots of area to develop our bilateral economic cooperation and targeting Southeast Asia, like infrastructure, energy, ICT, small and medium industries, transportation, healthcare. It's all mentioned by our first and second presenter in this session. But the infrastructure for example, China's infrastructure support to Southeast Asian countries is more for Chinese economic growth rather than local communities' needs. and ICT cooperation, and it is, we of course can make some money out of this kind of business opportunity in Southeast Asia, but at the same time, we have to mind that if our economic cooperation with Southeast Asian countries, it is really for the benefit of local communities. So in every area of our economic cooperation with Southeast Asian countries, we have to make we have to differentiate our approach to the Southeast Asian countries. My third point is that we have to mind the multilateralism in the region. Our two presenters from the U.S. and from Korea made excellent presentation on each government initiative to Southeast Asian countries and the region. But what is conspicuously missing there is multilateralism. Mr. Park Jae-kyung made a few comments on the regional multilateral cooperation and ASEAN centrality, but what kind of specific contribution that the South Korean government is making for the promotion of multilateral cooperation in the region? And most countries are targeting Southeast Asia as a main area of cooperation, and we have consensus that we have to respect ASEAN centrality. And of course, two governments talking about the ASEAN centrality, we support ASEAN centrality, but without strong multilateral cooperation and institutions in the region, the ASEAN centrality is kind of meaningless. So we have to think about how to promote and develop regional multilateral cooperation under new Southern policy as well as Indo-Pacific initiative. And on top of that, if a big power moves, then it of course it has big implication for the regional small and medium countries. And sometimes this move by big countries cause misunderstanding, which in turn cause criticism and resistance and indifference in many cases. To avoid this kind of backlash, we can pursue our strategy and initiative through multilateral institutions, and it would reduce regional countries' affiliation so much. And of course, if we make our efforts in multilateral institution, multilateral context, and it is good for spoke-to-spoke cooperation and discussion that I just mentioned, and also we can invite other spokes countries to join our discussion and debate on how to develop our economic cooperation and assistance to the Southeast Asian countries. I will just add one more sentence as a conclusion. And I just mentioned our approaches and directions and visions of our cooperation with the Southeast Asian countries, but fundamentally there's a big question still unanswered for me and for the Southeast Asian audience. For example, including Korea, regional countries do not have a clear picture on what is Indo-Pacific. We do not have a clear picture on that. And for the Southeast Asian, South Korean government, we are talking about new Southern policy, but there are still unanswered questions from Southeast Asian counterpart. What is really a new Southern policy? I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I'm going to mix things up a bit and bring in the question of India, a country that I think about a lot. We've heard this morning how the U.S. and South Korea have generally convergent policies in the Indo-Pacific, and that these convergences lend themselves to opportunities for cooperation, which is certainly true. India is a key factor in all this as well. As we've heard, both the New Southern Policy, Seoul's New Southern Policy and Washington's Indo-Pacific policy accord significance to working with India. So is this desirable? I would argue absolutely. Is it doable? Yes, but there are some challenges, which I'll address in a moment. But first, a bit of context. Clearly, the key criteria are in place for robust cooperation between the U.S., South Korea, and India in the Indo-Pacific region. First, there is a strong strategic rationale. All three countries share concerns about the activities of China in the Indo-Pacific region. All three countries have similar policies of enhanced engagement in the Indo-Pacific: Seoul's New Southern policy, Washington's Indo-Pacific policy, and India's Act East policy, which has been around longer than the other two policies. Second, there are institutional underpinnings for cooperation. There is a strategic partnership agreement between India and South Korea. There is a growing partnership between the U.S. and India, which has resulted in a number of major deals. And of course, the U.S. and South Korea have their long-standing alliance. So I'll flesh out briefly exactly what might drive India's thinking on the Indo-Pacific, and what motivates its Act East policy. And I'll offer just a few reflections. First, India's interest in engaging its neighbors to the east is not new at all. It's had a long-standing Look East policy, which preceded the Act East policy. It has emphasized links, mainly trade and economic in nature, with the region. But in recent years, this engagement has intensified. So over the past decade, for example, India's trade volumes with ASEAN have expanded fivefold. And we've also seen an uptick in formal India-ASEAN dialogues. And I'd cite two reasons for this increased engagement with the ASEAN region. One is economic. India needs more markets for its rapidly growing economy, and the ASEAN region has some of the fastest growing economies in the world. Also, India's economy needs not just markets, but also fuel, and there are critical energy markets in ASEAN. India has been importing fuel from Indonesia, and it has inked deals for oil exploration with Vietnam in recent years. Australia, with its ample natural gas and coal supplies, could be another key target. And keep in mind as well that a majority of India's current energy imports, including 2/3 of its oil imports, are sourced from the Middle East. So New Delhi likely views energy imports from the relatively more stable and closer to home ASEAN region as less fraught with risk and therefore better for energy security. A second reason why India is scaling up its engagement in the ASEAN region is strategic. It wants to gain a stronger diplomatic and economic foothold in a part of the world where China's influence and presence are considerable. So there are particular opportunities in place, like the Philippines and Vietnam, where China's deep footprint is at times not particularly welcome, and public opinion toward China has been unfavorable, as well as Myanmar, where the regime has tried to distance itself a bit from Beijing in recent years and take on a more independent foreign policy. So India's Act East policy, which was implemented in 2014, is essentially a reflection of New Delhi's desire to act with more haste to engage with ASEAN and the broader Indo-Pacific, but it's also a reflection of India's heightened concerns about China. And for India, economic, geopolitical, and security factors, all deeply interconnected, drive this concern. China is searching for markets to feed its own growing economy, and since this entails it being more active in Southeast Asia and South Asia, tensions are generated and security concerns come to the fore. India, of course, has its own economic reasons for deepening its role in Asia, which heightens competition with China and has the chance of generating tensions. India's economic motivations for expanding its engagement in the ASEAN region aggravate its security concerns in the region. India's relations with Vietnam, I think, provide a very useful case study. So India has deepened its ties with Vietnam significantly in recent years, in great part to facilitate access to energy opportunities there. So it now has an energy deal with Vietnam that grants oil exploration rights to India off the coast of Vietnam. India's growing interest in Vietnam mean that its energy security could now be directly affected by the territorial dispute in the South China Sea, in which Vietnam is very much embroiled. So even limited unrest in this region could endanger Indian oil exploration activities. More broadly, India's growing energy ties with Vietnam mean that it's increasingly caught up in the volatile web of geopolitics in the South China Sea. So this is not to say that India is actively seeking to stake out a position in the dispute. On the contrary, while it is certainly keen to deepen energy and broader economic cooperation with countries that are involved in the dispute, New Delhi does not want to be in a position where it needs to take a side. But if it succeeds in deepening ties with many of these countries, And if its cooperation with the U.S. in Asia continues to grow, then India may find itself increasingly perceived as being a member of an anti-China camp, even though New Delhi has little desire to antagonize Beijing. So while India really does wish to subtly push back against China's growing presence in the broader Indo-Pacific, it has no desire to provoke its powerful neighbor. So what does this all mean for prospects for U.S., South Korean, and Indian cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region? I think at the very least there are strong incentives to establish new working groups and trilateral arrangements that can serve as mechanisms for information sharing about the Indo-Pacific region on a variety of business and development opportunities. I think energy really deserves a very good look. India and South Korea, generally speaking, share similar energy profiles and priorities. Both countries rely on foreign imports and on hydrocarbons in particular. Both also want to focus more on renewables, particularly nuclear options. As I understand it, there is a South Korea-India civil nuclear accord, which is working toward implementation. Indian officials have praised the Korean Green Economy Initiative, which provides an opening, or which could provide an opening for cooperation on clean energy. More broadly, India and South Korea plan to set up a future strategy group, and energy cooperation between each government and each country's private sector is envisioned to be a key component of that. And India, as I described before, is already pursuing and concluding energy agreements in Southeast Asia, including in Vietnam and Indonesia. So is there any potential for South Korea to play a role in these engagements? And what about the U.S.? At the same time, and I'll start to conclude here, there are also considerable challenges of including India in these U.S.-South Korea efforts to forge cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And I'll briefly identify 5. First is the China factor. India, maybe more so than South Korea, wants to be careful and not risk antagonizing Beijing by conveying the impression that it's trying to band closer to other rivals of China. Now, certainly Beijing is a growing strategic rival of New Delhi's. Bilateral tensions have intensified in recent years, as we saw by a brief border standoff last year. And as the Belt and Road Initiative continues to develop, this is very worrisome to India. But India has a very deep trade relationship with China. The two do see eye to eye on several key policy issues, from terrorism to support for infrastructure investment. And New Delhi doesn't want to risk squandering that cooperation. A second possible challenge is the Japan factor, the Japan question. India and Japan have an extremely deep partnership. It's still deepening. It's probably one of the fastest growing partnerships in Asia. India's close ties to Japan could perhaps be problematic for South Korea, especially if New Delhi may want to bring Japan into any new type of cooperative mechanisms in the Indo-Pacific involving the U.S. and South Korea. Third, India is largely missing in action when it comes to economic institutions in the eastern and southern Indo-Pacific. India is not embedded in the main regional economic architecture. It certainly has a presence in economic institutions in other parts of Asia, like the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Central Asia, but it really is absent from the economic institutions to its east. So, not only is India not a part of APEC, it was never a part of the TPP, and there's some significant policy questions that emerge from this reality, one being how India may be affected by missing out on all the key supply chains in Southeast Asia if it continues not to be integrated into these regional economic groupings. And another question is how its absence from the likes of APEC could impact its potential for broader economic cooperation with South Korea and the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific. Fourth potential challenge, and sorry for being rather blunt, but India tends to move very slowly. When it forms new partnerships, it makes new deals, implementation tends to be very, very slow in the messy and complicated democracy that India is. Fifth and finally, India has the tendency to get distracted from its efforts to act east. It does not focus laser-like on the Indo-Pacific to its east. It gets distracted by its problems with Pakistan, and above all, by all types of internal political issues. Now, obviously, this challenge of getting distracted by other matters is a problem for all 3 countries, not just India. So all this said, I would conclude that, there are some considerable challenges in terms of getting India to work with the U.S. and South Korea, but I think that there is a compelling reason to seek ways to include India in efforts to ramp up U.S.-South Korea cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Park and Dr. Face for a good presentation, and panelists with a precious comment. I would like to comment about the three things. The current situation from the is a basically journalistic point of view, the way to synergize both strategy and the role of the private sectors. First, I think one of the problems about the new Southern policy is feasibility. This policy plans a lot of things that affect economic activities, but the political and the diplomatic problems are very complicated and hard to solve. Especially now the Korean government is focusing too much on North Korean issues. The U.S. has the same problem as Korea. The free and open Indo-Pacific strategy has no specific action plan. That's the reason why we are here, to find the specific action plan. The U.S. made a plan, but do not suggest clearly how to implement it. The objective of this strategy seems only to put pressure on China. I would say the new Southern policy and the Indo-Pacific strategy is not a top priority for both countries. I worry that the power of this policy is relatively weak. In addition to this, the solutions of these policies are dependent too much on how to solve the main issues. They are focusing, as I said, North Korea and the China issues. Even though we understand this situation, the cooperation of both countries is very important in many aspects. The economic and the political power of Korea is growing. As the U.S. point of view, to curb Chinese influence, the role of Korea is critical. How about China? China is doing their One Belt, One Road project in this area. U.S. and China are fighting a trade war. Several days ago, there was the summit between U.S. and China. They agreed 90 days trade truce. However, all of you saw the news today. It is released that top executive and daughter of the founder of the Chinese tech giant Huawei was arrested on Saturday in Canada at the request of the U.S. This likely escalate tensions between the two countries at this delicate moment. In addition to this, there is tension between these two big countries in political and even in military issues. Someone said, in a short amount of time, many countries in this area have to choose one country, the U.S. or the China, as their ally. The position of South Korea is also unclear. Korea is a strong ally of the U.S., but economically, Korea is very highly connected with China. The trade volume with China is much bigger than the volume with the U.S. Korea experienced especially the economic revenge from China after the U.S. deployed the THAAD missile system in Korea. The unfair punishment from China is not completely finished. So many Korean companies are now not treated equally as other companies in China. Under this political and economic environment, Korea and the U.S. have to find a way to synergize two strategies, new Southern policy and Indo-Pacific strategy. From now on, I will discuss several things about this. To make a synergy, these two countries have to divide their political and economic problems. As you know, Korea and the U.S. alliance is very important. Korea and the U.S. share the experience of working together to fight against China and North Korea before. The U.S. and Korea have to reconfirm this alliance and the relationship between the two countries whenever and wherever there is doubt about this. In geopolitical issues, for example, the South China Sea and the North Korea denuclearization problem, Korea has to share more with the U.S. rather than with any other countries. However, economic issues are different. Economic problems can can be a positive sum game. Without harming others, somebody can get benefits if we design a good mechanism. If there is a room for a positive sum game, both countries have to pursue it. To find a way for economic cooperation, I would like to suggest several things. First, Korea and the U.S. should respect multilateralism principles, as Dr. Lee said before. In trade and economic issues, bilateral agreements are not so good for small and medium countries, including Korea. For example, Korea has a plan to join RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which are critical to the Korean economy because Korean economy is open economy. I think Korea wants the U.S. to join both multilateral trade agreements to solve the complicated global economic problems. Actually, U.S. is depending too much on the bilateral trade agreement, such as FTA, under the America First doctrine. Second, I would like to emphasize the reciprocity principle to handle China. Korea and the U.S. will have a lot of chances in which they discuss and make an agreement with China. In these cases, the reciprocity principle is very important. After joining the WTO system in 2001, China benefited a lot from the world trading system, but they did not pay as much as they benefit. These days, China advocates free trade against America's protectionism, but there are a lot of unfair things between China and other countries in trade and economic issues. Even though China claims to make a global free trade system, the standard in their own country is below the global standard. At this point, Korea and the U.S. together need to request China to be transparent and open as much as they can to reach the global standard under reciprocity principle. Third, Korea needs to try to make a middle power countries alliance against the superpower countries. The U.S. will recognize and support this action among middle power countries. The idea is actually, I know from Australia. Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia also consider joining the middle power alliance in this area. This alliance can suggest some ideas to lessen the tension between superpower countries such as U.S., China, or Russia. Next part is about the role of private sectors. The role of private sector is very important to develop this area because the government investment has a limit in volume and effect. Until now, the international organization in this area were not doing well. For example, AIIB and ADB. Especially, there are conflicts between China and the ASEAN countries about One Belt, One Road project. For example, these days, the Malaysian government asked China to stop the One Belt, One Road project because it is not efficient, and this project was also used for corruption by the previous government. To make a synergy effect, it is important to empower the private sector coalition. The role of government should be limited to making institutions for the private sectors. I would like to share my experience from participating in many global
Mr. Rowe,
meetings.
I don't want to, I apologize. Can you wrap up in about 1 minute or so because we're going to have to begin to close this session, and I do want to try to offer at least one question from the floor.
Okay.
Sorry,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, no problem. Yeah. So, the last one, I'd like to suggest the ideal combination between Korea and the U.S. is Korean skill and the U.S. capital. So that's the best way because Korea has a very good skill and the U.S. has a lot of capital. The both of them is conglomerated. There would be a synergy effect. So I'd like to wrap up my comment. Three kinds of things I emphasize. First one is Korea and the U.S. divide the political and economic problems, and multilateralism should be respected much more than now. And the third one, Korea and U.S. government co-work with encourage private sectors to enter into these areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our foreign discussants for their comments. Now, we are standing in the way of having to get the room turned around for lunch, but according to my watch, we may have time for one quick question that can be tabled to the panel from the audience. Please. Microphone's coming.
Good morning. Thank you for the discussion.
There you go.
Thank you so much. Sorry, it's working. Thank you so much for the discussion. My name is Josh Blumenfeld. I'm with an American NGO called Malaria No More. One question I had in particular for Mr. Park is, for those of us who've been watching Korea for a long time, it's exciting to see Korea emerge in a much more dynamic fashion, thinking about its role in Southeast Asia and moving away from a much more transactional approach, both to security arrangements and to economic and trade investment. My question, though, is about KOICA in particular. So KOICA has lots of new big missions, one in Phnom Penh. It's a beautiful compound. It looks almost like the U.S. Embassy in Phnom Penh. And I'm wondering to what extent your government is thinking about Korean soft power through KOICA in ASEAN, and particularly on the areas of global health. As you know, that's not just a philanthropic, benevolent investment, right? The United States uses foreign aid, in particular health, as a huge instrument of American power. It has the dual benefits of both saving millions of lives, if you look across the continent of Africa, for example, but also redounds enormous economic, political, and security benefits back to the United States. So is Korea thinking about its soft power footprint in ASEAN, particularly via KOICA? Do you think there's an opportunity for Korea to lead the way in global health in the region?
Okay. And why don't we then just get one more question on the table, and then we'll allow responses from the floor. I'm sorry, from the table. One other question from the audience? So one focus on Korea's soft power, health. Anything else? Once, twice. Folks are ready for lunch. Oh, one there. Okay, great. Thank you. One in the back there. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Caroline, and I am from the Albright-Stonebridge Group. And before I joined ASG, I was studying Chinese sanctioned behavior. And part of my research, I was looking at a lot of these big conglomerate reports that were talking about how, to make up for the lost revenue from China, they would turn to Southeast Asia to re-strategize and allocate their resources. Now that China and South Korea have normalized their relations, how are these big companies managing their priorities between Southeast Asia and China and allocating their resources and strategy?
Great. Thank you very much. So, first question, responses, Korea, soft power in Southeast Asia. Are there thoughts, opportunities?
It's fortunate that I came here together with a colleague from the ODA department from MOFA. So for details, I would introduce her to you. For soft power, so before going into soft power, the countries in the Mekong region, so-called CLMV, the priority destinations for Korea's grant aid, not only Cambodia, but Laos and Myanmar, Vietnam as well. And recently, Indonesia is also on the top list. The KOICA's funding will be doubled in coming years, as my Vice Minister mentioned earlier. And the priority countries will remain for this. And health is definitely one of the issues, as I mentioned, to have a better quality of life in the region. The health should be definitely. And then also the agriculture. I think many in the room have heard the Sema Ulundong, the New Village movement. And the people in the region, they just accept the Sema Ulundong in Korean wording instead of the English translated version like SMU. So the three fields I mentioned. And the soft power is again definitely the voluntary movement. There's a very limited role for the government to give something to the general public, thanks to our powerful companies like JYP, SM, YZ. So the K-pop and K-dramas. Thanks to that, of course, the companies in Korea and in the region are making use of the trend. We call it like K-food or K-seafood or K-beauty or K-style, which is influencing the cosmetics and so on. And I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. Other thoughts or comments, reactions to the second question?
Can I just make a quick comment on the Korean soft power in Southeast Asia? And your question is exactly the question I'm getting from my Southeast Asian colleague, that the South Korea's dramas and movies, song are quite popular, and there is accumulated Korea soft power in Southeast Asia, but they say, they don't see the Korean government's strategy to develop further cooperation or further relation, deeper relation based on this soft power. And I would say the South Korean government is still learning how to make most out of our soft power. I mean, this is kind of new sort of development in the eyes of Korean public and the government as well. And they at the moment, South Korean government is putting so much emphasis on Southeast Asian countries' economic development that there is specifically, a lot of demands from Southeast Asian countries to share our own experience in the economic development and also the social cultural cooperation with Southeast Asian countries. The next step is to develop strategic and security cooperation with Southeast Asian countries, fully utilizing South Korea's soft power in Southeast Asia.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts or comments to the last question around sort of, if I understand you correctly, sort of changes in the strategies of large companies from Korea and in terms of how they're looking at ASEAN? Oh, looking at China. Okay, so how they're looking really at the regional space. Okay. Any thoughts or reactions there? From a Korean corporate perspective.
Can you specify, clarify your question? I couldn't quite understand what you're saying in your question.
So a lot of the reports said that because they had lost revenue in China, they had to re-strategize and invest their human resources and allocate a lot of their strategy to Southeast Asia. And now that the relations with China have normalized, how does that change the dynamic with these big companies that have already invested in Southeast Asia?
So are the companies going to leave ASEAN and go to China, so to speak, now?
No, not really. I mean, this is the kind of new development as far as South Korean business is concerned. After the sour relations between Korea and China, when the South Korean government made the decision to deploy THAAD, there was economic sanction from the Chinese government, and at the beginning of this Moon Jae-in government, there was widespread discourse of post-China. And can we replace China's market with the Southeast Asia market and our investment in Southeast Asia rather than China? I mean, Southeast Asia is a kind of a new opportunity for South Korea, even if we already invested a lot in Southeast Asia. But one thing is quite clear. Chinese market cannot be replaced by Southeast Asia. And our view on Southeast Asian market and Southeast Asia as an investment destination is additional, rather than completely replacing China.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been a great audience this morning. Thank you. Very much appreciated. Please join me again in thanking our presenters and speakers.